So, like I said, hopefully by now you have been told that you should be doing exercise, but the big question is why? So, why should you be doing exercise? And like I said, we're going to talk about these 4 different categories that hopefully will answer this question for you. 5 categories, sorry. So we're going to start off with a little simple physiology lesson. It's really important, I think, to understand what's going on in your brain, even on a basic level, so that you can get a better in-depth understanding of why exercise is important and what's actually happening when you're doing it. So this is a picture of the brain, and what I wanted to point out to you here is this little area in purple. I'm going to see if I can point that out for you here, down there. And that's an area called the substantia nigra in your brain. So that's deep in the inside of your brain. And with Parkinson's disease, which we know is a progressive neurological condition, what happens is we lose something called dopamine. And that little purple area is where most of this dopamine is formulated. So just to give you a picture of where it is in your brain. So what does dopamine do? Dopamine essentially sends signals that help coordinate smooth functional movement in our day-to-day lives. It's also responsible for things like working memory, some reward behaviors, sleep, etc. And like I said, with Parkinson's, we start to lose this dopamine, this neurotransmitter. So what happens is we start to lose this smooth functional movement, and that's what starts to create the motor symptoms that come out as we get diagnosed. So here's a picture you can see of a neuron in your brain, and you can see on the top over here is a normal neuron with lots of dopamine in the synapse. So lots of that neurotransmitter going across, and below down here you can see this is somebody who has Parkinson's disease, and you can see there's a lot less of that neurotransmitter dopamine. So it's a very important neurotransmitter, and we're going to be talking about it in the context of exercise. So I just want you to have an idea of where it is and what that kind of looks like. So the good news is that we know we lose our dopamine with Parkinson's, but the good news is that we know our brains are neuroplastic. So what that means is that though we can't create more dopamine, we can actually improve the way this dopamine works. So that's your basic physiology lesson today, and we'll be getting into more of that a little bit later, like I said, in relation to exercise. So when we're talking about treating Parkinson's, there's generally 3 types of treatment, major treatment kind of categories that we talk about. So number 1 is medication, and hopefully you've heard about that through your doctor, your neurologist if you've seen one already. The medication, the goal of the medication in Parkinson's is to help manage your symptoms so that you can function on a day-to-day basis as optimally as possible. And that includes giving you the capacity to exercise at the intensity and at the amount that we actually want you to. So medication is not a permanent solution. It's not a replacement of dopamine permanently, but it does temporarily help to increase those symptoms. And that's why, as you've heard, I'm sure, you have to take medication fairly frequently throughout the day to keep that dopamine in the brain. The category of other therapies is kind of a global category. That includes everything from speech language therapists to counseling. It includes things like diet, which we know is a really hot topic in Parkinson's right now, including the gut microbiome, which they're doing lots of studies on. And the third one is exercise. So obviously that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Exercise is the only solution that we have right now that's been shown to mitigate disease progression. So again, it doesn't give you more dopamine in the brain permanently, but we know that it can help you manage the symptoms now and mitigate disease progression over time. And it's a really, really important thing, especially when you're newly diagnosed, to understand that, because we know that the earlier you start, the better those results are. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what the research says about Parkinson's and exercise. So how the research works is that basically what's happened over the last 10 years or so is there's been a big flood of studies on exercise and Parkinson's, and they started these studies in animals. So this is not a mouse from a real study. I actually think it's a guinea pig, but it's a picture to give you a little bit of a visual of what we're going to be talking about. So we know that the research on Parkinson's tells us that exercise is really important. It's an integral part of treating Parkinson's, but we're going to go into a little bit of the details of what it actually says and how they do it. So when they did animal studies originally on exercise and Parkinson's, what they did is they created a Parkinsonism in these mice. So they essentially gave them Parkinson's by lesioning the brain, and then they exercised them. So they exercised them at varying intensities through different modalities, and they watched what happened. What they decided to do after, and this is a really important point, is that they then created a forced non-use scenario. And what that means, that's why you see the little cast in the picture here, is they actually casted the Parkinson side that they created. So what that did is they essentially forced them not to exercise with that side, and then they decided to see what happened from there. So the results of these studies were really, really encouraging. What they found is that exercise in animals decreased their symptoms, their motor symptoms, and their deficits. What they also found, which was another very important point, was that when they casted the Parkinson side of these animals, those deficits returned. So when they couldn't exercise and when they weren't exercising, those deficits came back. So this kind of spurred a whole bunch of studies in humans. So next we went on to doing some human research to see what this actually looks like in real people. So when you look at the research in human studies, there's been lots of them, and they're still doing lots of them on exercise. I'm going to talk about one today, and that's what these pictures are here for. This was a study that was done by Alberts and his team in 2011, and this was one of the big studies that kind of exploded onto the scene, telling us that forced exercise and the intensity of exercise that you do is actually quite important in what happens to your symptoms. So this study was done on tandem bicycles, stationary tandem bicycles. And what they did is they essentially created a forced exercise scenario where half the participants were cycling at their own self-selected pace, and the other half were cycling with somebody in front at a forced intensity, so a higher pace than they would have self-selected. So what they found in this study is that the group that had a forced exercise scenario, so that were cycling at a higher intensity than what they normally would have self-selected, had significantly more improvements in their symptoms than the group that were exercising at their own chosen intensity, which tended to be lower. So they did this study. They had them bike for 8 weeks. They were doing 40-minute sessions, and on the bike, they were doing a revolutions per minute at 85 to 90. So that's a number that we tend to use when you're looking at biking or exercising. 85 to 90 repetitions per minute is revolutions per minute is a number that we tend to kind of stick with. So the results of this study essentially supported the idea that a higher intensity of exercise creates better effects in symptoms and creates better neuroplastic change in the brain. And what they did is they did scans after, and scans are a great way to see kind of the cortical activity and what's going on. So if you take a look at this picture with a black background here, what they did is they scanned people when they were on medication over here, and you can see these little areas of orange are deep in the brain where that dopamine is released, and you can see that those are pretty lit up. Then they scanned people off medication. You can see that those areas go significantly down. And then what they did is they scanned people on, post-exercise off medication. So they are not on medication in this third scenario, but they have done forced intensity exercise. And what you can see is that this looks very similar to the first picture here, where they are on medication. So those areas are quite lit up, and that's a very significant finding because it means that exercise can light up those same areas of the brain and create neuroplastic change in those areas, the same areas that the medication affects. So that was a really interesting and great study to show us that the exercise intensity that you use is important. And it kind of spurred a whole bunch of research on exercise and Parkinson's and what can actually happen. So the people in the study had improvements in rigidity, they had improvements in tremor, they had improvements in bradykinesia or slowness of movement. And that was all after 8 weeks. Now, one more thing that I want to point out about this study is that they did a follow-up. So what they did is 4 weeks later, they checked in with these people and they retested. And what they found is that people who stopped exercising and weren't doing any forced exercise or biking had a decline back to nearly towards their original levels of all those symptom areas. So again, this leads us in the direction of believing that it is truly, truly important that you keep doing the exercise and that it's a lifelong habit that be maintained, because if you stop, then we see those results start to decline back towards where they were before. So that's a study that I just wanted to point out. You can see the reference at the bottom there if you want to take a peek in more detail, but that was one of the first studies that really kind of drew our attention to how important intensity is in exercise with Parkinson's disease. So we know that these people saw these improvements in this study, and in a lot of other studies as well. We've seen that people see improvements in motor and non-motor symptoms. So I just want to talk very briefly with you about how that actually works, what's actually happening in your brain to create that. So first things first, this is still being studied, right? We don't have any clear 100% definitive answers. There are a lot of studies that support different theories, but we don't have one clear specific answer only. There's a lot of hot topics in the research right now on things like, the gut microbiome and cannabis and different things on exercise and new drugs and therapies. So there's a lot of research being done now, including on exercise, but we're going to talk a little bit about what the research has shown with respect to theories on what's happening when you exercise and what's happening in your brain. So very briefly, we're going to talk about neuroprotection, neurorepair, and adaptation. So when it comes to neuroprotection, what we're talking about is those neurons in your brain that create dopamine and release dopamine are often subject to something called oxidative stress. So that means that they get damaged, they get stressed, and they get destroyed. So one of the things that they found with exercise is that we actually can reduce oxidative stress. So what that means is we're essentially decreasing the destruction of these dopaminergic neurons that are in your brain. Now, again, why is this important? Well, we know that when you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, even if you may only have mild symptoms to begin with, that you have lost dopamine in your brain. Once you have lost dopamine, you can't get it back. So we have no way right now of getting that dopamine back, but we do have a way of protecting the dopamine that's there. And that's part of what exercise does. We're trying to protect everything that is left in that brain and optimize it as much as possible. Neurorepair. So what we want to do also in the brain when we're talking about neuroplastic change through exercise is we want to make sure that everything that's helping the dopamine function is working as well as it can. So when the dopamine goes across the neuron in that picture that you saw previously, it has to attach to receptors and it has to get through from one side of the neuron to the other. And we want to make sure that everything that's helping it do that in the brain is as optimized as possible. And that's one of the other areas that exercise really, really helps with. So essentially what we're doing is we're helping to protect what's left in the brain and we're helping to optimize what's happening in the brain currently. Adaptation is something that we talk about a little bit later on in Parkinson's. And so we're not going to go into detail about that today, but essentially what it does is to help adapt the different pathways into your brain to, again, optimize them and make them function as well as they can. So just a little background on how that actually works. So let's talk about the pros and cons of exercise now. So what, does exercise do? We talked about how does it work? We talked about. Now let's talk about what it can actually do and the pros and cons of it. So one of the things we know about people living with Parkinson's is that when you check the level of activity in that population, people tend to be less active than their age-matched peers. So generally, because people, even at diagnosis, have started to have some motor symptoms, we tend to see that they're less active than somebody of the same age who doesn't have Parkinson's disease. So what we need to look at is the fact that all the benefits you get from exercise, even if you don't have Parkinson's, still apply. So we know from the research that exercise and physical activity helps with cognitive scores. It helps with your vascular health and your cardiovascular health. We know that it can reduce your chance of having heart issues and osteoporosis, which are brittle bones. It can reduce your risk of falls. It helps you live longer, and it has an anti-inflammatory effect, and a ton more. We know generally that exercise is very, very, very beneficial to our brains and our bodies. So when we look at Parkinson's, you still get all these same effects, right? You get all the wonderful effects that exercise has for anyone in an aging population, but then you also get this bonus, which is that you get improved motor and non-motor symptoms, and you also get mitigation of disease progression. So we get all the benefits of regular activity plus these big important bonuses, which is managing your condition and how it looks now and how it looks in the future. The cons of exercise. So I like this slide because it's very true in that every medication you take is going to have side effects, right? We know that there are no medications that have zero side effects. Often with the medications related to Parkinson's, you can get on and off periods. There can be nausea and vomiting and dizziness and all kinds of different things. Doesn't mean that they're not worth taking. They're very important medications, but it's important to remember that there are little to no negative side effects of exercise, right? If you're doing exercise that's properly prescribed, then the side effects are usually none, and the benefits are hugely astronomical when it comes to Parkinson's disease. So the big question that I always get asked is, what can exercise do for me? Is it actually going to help? What's it going to change if I'm putting all this effort in? So that's what we're going to talk about now. So this is a classic kind of stereotypical picture of that we see of a Parkinson's patient, and where Parkinson's is trying to take you with respect to posture and alignment and symptoms. So we see this kind of flexed posture in the trunk and in the hips and in the knees. And we see this rigidity or stiffness, this bradykinesia, which is slowness of movement. Often we see a mask face, and we can see, this reduced arm swing, shuffling gait, all those different things. So that's kind of the classic picture that we're often presented with. I like to show people the kind of concept of what exercise can do for you, and a picture that looks a little bit different. So these are a few pictures of what I like to think exercise can help you look like and help maintain over time. So these are all Parkinson's clients, doing exercise and staying active, and just shows a little bit of what they can do. So there's a very different picture of Parkinson's that we don't always see, especially, if you're looking online or you're newly diagnosed and just researching and searching things. It's important to recognize that picture of Parkinson's isn't the be all end all, and that we can actually create our own picture through exercise. So when we're getting into a little bit of more detail, we're going to talk about what the actual effects of exercise are on your symptoms. So we know, again, through the research and through experience as well, that exercise can improve motor symptoms. So exercise can help you improve your walking, your gait. It can help improve with shuffling. It can help decrease freezing, which is that feeling of being stuck to the floor if you're experiencing that. We know that it can improve balance, that it can reduce your falls risk. Posture and alignment is a huge one that exercise helps to improve both early and later on. Rigidity is a common complaint or symptom that we get reported, and that can contribute to things like back pain, shoulder pain, things like that. And we know that exercise can help reduce rigidity, and generally that it can help you keep you functioning better for longer. So, over time, even if you're not having all those symptoms now, we want to help prevent that happening in the future, or at least lengthen the amount of time before those symptoms start to come on. Another thing that exercise is very important for is improving body awareness. So one thing that I talk a lot to new clients about is their awareness of where their body is in space and what their body is doing. Our brains are very good at adapting and being neuroplastic, which is a great thing, but it also means that as these symptoms develop slowly, you may not notice them as much as you think. And this often comes in the form of somebody telling you, you're not really swinging your arm when you're walking, or why are you starting to shuffle, or I can't hear your voice as well. Often people around us will actually help to kind of diagnose those symptoms because we may not notice them individually over time as our brain just adapts and changes and tries to help us function. So exercise can really help improve that awareness. And if we're aware of it, it means we can change it. If you're not aware of it, it's very difficult to change. The other thing that exercise can do is it can improve non-motor symptoms. So often the non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's are as challenging as the motor symptoms. And some of these include decrease in mood. We know depression is a very common non-motor symptom. Fatigue is one that I hear very commonly, that people feel exhausted and tired all the time. And often that becomes a challenging barrier to exercise. And it's important to understand that exercising can actually help manage that fatigue. And it doesn't make it worse. So they've done studies on fatigue and exercise in Parkinson's and shown that the fatigue is not worsened through exercise. And that's really important to recognize if you are having significant fatigue, to try and decrease that as a barrier to exercising. Cognition is a big one. So we know that using Parkinson-specific exercise can help to improve cognition and protect cognition. Sleep is another one that we get a lot of reports of, sleep issues early on as an early symptom and worsening sleep issues over time. So exercise, can really help to manage those sleep patterns, help with your circadian rhythm, and just to help regulate that patterning overnight. And writing is another one. So often one of the early symptoms of Parkinson's is what we call micrographia or small writing. And we know that global high amplitude exercise can actually help with writing as well. So overall, the biggest things that exercise can do are they can mitigate your disease progression, they can improve your symptoms now, and they can improve your quality of life, which are the big goals that we're talking about when we're talking about exercise and Parkinson's. So the big question, how do I do it? I'm telling you should exercise. I'm telling you that it's going to help and it's very important, but how do you actually go about doing it? So we're going to talk now about 4 different categories to help kind of give you a picture of what the exercise you're doing should look like and how you can go about creating a program that's going to be most optimal for you. So FIT is a principle that we use in training. It stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type. And these are very general guidelines, but hopefully will give you an idea of kind of what we're looking for when we talk about exercise in Parkinson's disease. So frequency, 5 to 7 days of the week. It sounds like a lot, but again, the repetition is important and maintaining that over time is very important as well. So I like to say 5 to 7. Usually that leaves people somewhere around 5, but if we say 2, then people end up with 1. So 5 to 7 is a good guesstimate of where you should be at. And again, making sure that the program is something that you can maintain 5 to 7 days of the week over the long term. Intensity. So as you saw in that study that I talked about, the intensity can be very, very important with respect to Parkinson's specific exercise. We like to see people exercising at a moderate to high intensity. Now, that doesn't have to be the only type of exercise you do when it comes to things like Tai Chi or dance, which also have support in the research. Those things can be helpful, but that having some component of moderate to high intensity in your daily routine is very important. So it doesn't mean it has to be the only kind, but it is important to make sure it's in there. And we're talking about the moderate to high intensity. We want to see at least 30 minutes. So in the exercise guidelines, they usually break this down into bouts of no less than 10 minutes at a time. So if you're going to do 30 minutes a day, you want to do this in bouts of no less than 10 minutes. Now, again, if you're going to be doing this in bouts of 10 minutes at a time, it has to be high intensity. You need to make sure that you're getting in that high intensity component of it. I would argue that it is challenging to make sure that your body is warmed up, get in a high intensity bout, and make sure that your body is cooled down within 10 minutes. So that 30-minute guideline kind of gives you a chance to make sure that you're getting that high intensity, that your body is prepared to do that high intensity first, and that you have a chance to cool down afterwards. So the type of exercise. There are a lot of types of exercise that are supported in the research. They tend to help with different things. So we know aerobic and interval training are very good for targeting all of the major motor symptoms in Parkinson's. So those ones are kind of key, important ones to keep in mind. There's also evidence that things like yoga and Tai Chi and dance can help. Those are very often helping with things like balance, decrease in rigidity, those areas more specifically than some of the functional tasks, but they're still very good ways to build in high amplitude Parkinson specific movements into your day. Boxing has had some very strong and new support in the research, which is why you see a lot of boxing classes coming out now. Boxing is a high intensity, high amplitude exercise. So that's part of the reason we know it's so effective. It's just one option for high amplitude and high intensity, but it has shown in the research to be very, very good at improving those Parkinson's symptoms. Strength training. So strength training has some mixed results in the research. Strength training is important, but how you do it is even more important. So again, if you look at that classic picture of Parkinson's, there are certain postures and alignments that Parkinson's will pull you into those flexed postures. So when we're talking about strength training, that's going to be the most effective, we're talking about big multi-joint functional exercises and exercises that are really challenging you to get into postures that pull you out of that kind of forward flexed posture that you saw in that initial picture that I showed you. So strength training is a very good component to have in your program. You just need to make sure that it is specific to your symptoms and that it's helping, not hindering the alignment that you're getting into. So POWER stands for Parkinson's Wellness Recovery, if you haven't heard of it. POWER is a type of functional high amplitude movement. So again, it's just another option of a way to introduce high amplitude functional movement into your program. And if you're looking for POWER, you can find POWER certified therapists and POWER classes through the Parkinson's Society BC. They have a great resource that shows you all the classes in the city. And if you see POWER, that means that the instructor is POWER certified. So that's the basic fit of Parkinson's specific exercise for you guys. So these are some guidelines. Now I'm sure you probably can't read all of that tiny writing, but these are some guidelines that have been created that support that fit principle. You can see the red and white one there is the activity guidelines that were developed by the Canadian Physiotherapy Association in combination with the Parkinson's Society of Canada. And again, they're suggesting, that if you exercise, you're going to do better than if you don't, and that it's a lifelong commitment, and that you need to be doing those aerobic, high intensity activities multiple days per week, and including balance and strength in there. So these are just some guidelines that if you want a resource to look at, they help support, like I said, the frequency and intensity, time and type that we just talked about. One of the things that the guidelines also mentions is that for better effect, we want to go up from what they talk about as 150 minutes a week to 300 minutes a week. And the only key important point there is to say that generally, when it comes to exercise for Parkinson's disease, more is better. So 150 minutes a week, approximately 20 to 30 minutes a day is great. If you can do an hour a day, then even better. So next up, we're going to talk about key factors in your exercise routine. So what's important when you're putting together a routine or thinking about an exercise plan? As physiotherapists, we always say that the best type of exercise is the type of exercise that you're going to do. So if you find a type of exercise, that people say is great for Parkinson's, but you don't enjoy it and you're not going to do it, then it's not right for you. It has to be, again, something that can be lifelong and that you really do enjoy doing. So that's the first thing to think about when you're developing a plan. What type of exercise do you like to do? The next thing to think about is whether or not it's challenging you physically and mentally. So again, intensity is an important component, and even when you're doing strength training or yoga or Tai Chi or anything like that, part of the intensity is making sure that you are being physically challenged in a safe environment. So if the exercise you're doing is not challenging, then it's probably not changing you. So like we like to say as physiotherapists, if it's challenging you, it's changing you. If we want to change the brain and create neuroplastic change, it has to be challenging. The other component that it has to be challenging in is cognitively. So we want to make sure that when we're doing our activity, it's physically challenging, but it's also mentally challenging so that your brain is being challenged to change your body. Now that can be anywhere from dance combinations being challenging to keep up with, mentally and cognitively. It can be boxing combinations. It can be, a group class where you're challenged to, think of different things, think of different categories as you're doing exercises, anything like that, where you're finding that your brain is challenged at the same time as your body. Is it specific to your symptoms? So, general exercise is great. I always tell people, there's nothing wrong with doing general exercise. Going for a bike ride is great. But it is really, really important that you also have exercise that is specific to the symptoms that you are experiencing. So we're going to talk a little bit more in the last section here about assessment and prescription and program implementation and who and where you can get that. But it is really important to know that they call Parkinson's the designer disease, right? Everyone's symptoms are a little bit different. And it is really important that you get a program that has some component that is specific to your symptoms. Will you continue to do it? So I know I've been harping on this fact a little bit, but again, if you're in an intensive program and it's something that you're going to manage to keep up for 2 weeks, it's not going to change you. So We know that in that biking study, they did an 8-week-long program, and that's when they really started to see the changes over 8 weeks. And when they checked 4 weeks later, if you'd stopped exercising, those symptoms started to come back. So again, this is something that needs to be long term. So developing a program that you can continue to do that's feasible for you to do over the long term. Doesn't include powerful high amplitude movements. So again, intensity is important, and making sure that there's some component of your exercise program that includes these large, full body, high amplitude movements is key. So I always like to tell people Parkinson's tends to make you stiff, it tends to make your movements small, and it tends to make you slow. So we want to counter that in our exercise program by doing these fast, high amplitude, powerful movements in a safe environment. Now, again, this doesn't have to be every day of your program, but it is a really important component to build into it. Does it suit your budget, personality, schedule, and functional level? So again, these are just things to consider. You know, budget is important when you're looking long term. Is it something that you enjoy doing? Is it going to fit in your schedule long term? And functionally, is it at your level? So again, there's different varying levels of Parkinson's disease, and it's important that you're when you're doing exercise, whether it be in a group class or in a gym or however you're doing it, that you're being challenged at your functional level. Okay? So next up, settings. So we're going to talk a little bit about, where you can do these exercises and some pros and cons of each. And if you have specific questions, again, we can answer those at the end. So there's 3 kind of areas that we are going to talk about when it comes to pros and cons. So online we'll talk about briefly, but not a lot. So the first 3 are group classes, one-to-one treatment, and gym or home programs. So each of these has their pros and cons. When we're talking about group classes, we know that the social support that's created in group classes is a very, very good and beneficial component to them. We know that you can be challenged in group classes very often if they're set at the right functional level. Group classes tend to be constantly changing, which is a very good thing when it comes to exercise and Parkinson's disease. So because the exercises that you're doing in a group class will tend to vary and adapt over time, it means that your brain is constantly being challenged to work out new movement patterns and to figure out how to do those exercises best. So that's one of the big bonuses that you get in a group class. Some of the challenges that you can find in a group class is sometimes they're not split by level, which can be very challenging. Again, you need to be working at a level that's challenging for you. And if there's varying levels in a class, you need to make sure you find one that fits where you can still be challenged. You don't get as much one-to-one attention. So if you're looking for a very specific symptom treatment program, group classes won't necessarily give you the individualized attention you're looking for. And they tend to be a little bit less specific than one-on-one treatment. So one-on-one treatment, as opposed to the group classes above, can give you that individualized specific training. They tend to cost a lot more, so budget can be an important thing to think about there. They provide a lot of accountability. So when you have one-to-one treatments, somebody's there, they're waiting for you, you're going to show up, and you're going to do the exercise. And they can address specific concerns. So things like safety or falls risk or individualized goals or specific things or concerns or questions that you have that may not be answered in a group class. Gym or home programs. So gym and home programs have their pros for sure. There was a big study that was done recently that compared group classes, physiotherapy, one-to-one treatments, and gym or home programs. And not surprisingly, the gym and home programs tended to be the least effective with respect to changes in symptoms and physical improvement. Now, part of the reason is that gym and home programs often are not done optimally, so they're not necessarily designed properly, and they're not often followed very well. So this depends largely on your motivation and your capacity to do these at a high intensity and motivate yourself to actually do them on a regular basis. So the pros is that they're, very easily accessible. Usually people have a gym nearby, or doing it at home is a really easy way to make sure that it's accessible to you anytime. And you have a lot of personal control over what you're doing. Again, cons are that sometimes they're not done properly. And the research shows that if that's all you're doing, it tends to be the least effective. One of the things that I like to say about gym or home programs is they're a great adjunct to the other things that you may be doing. So if you're doing a class once a week, or you're doing a group exercise session with friends or whatever it may be, gym or home programs are a great option to have for other days of the week, or maybe when you're traveling or need other options. So the last one is online. Now there are new online kind of options coming out. I have a set of free online exercise videos if you're looking for a place to start through the website that you can try for free. You just follow along and I do the exercises with you, but there's also a lot of other online options that are starting to come up as people are finding more access to computers and different electronic modalities. So these can be very good. Now you have to be a little bit careful to vet who is running the program and what they're doing. So sometimes online, we always run the risk of not knowing exactly what the background of the person teaching is, or what their goals are. So just making sure that if you're using online options, that you're just exploring carefully who is teaching them, and that they actually are Parkinson specific and suited to your needs. So those are some of the basic settings that you can do these exercises in. The last thing is to just answer some questions that I get very commonly around this topic, which is, when should I do exercise and for how long? So we know that when it comes to neuroplastic change in the brain, the earlier you start exercising, the better. So the moment you get diagnosed, we should be getting you on a proper Parkinson-specific exercise plan. Again, this is very, very supported in the research. So as soon as you can, you want to make sure that you're on a proper exercise plan. And we know, again, I think I've harped on this enough that hopefully everyone is clear on this now. These plans need to be lifelong. You need to be exercising for life if we want to create and maintain that brain change, manage those symptoms, and mitigate the disease progression. So I like to say that when it comes to Parkinson's, we kind of have the use it or lose it principle on steroids. So for everyone, for the general population, if you're not exercising and you're not using your muscles and using your motor patterns, they're not going to be there when you need them. They're not going to function properly. And when it comes to Parkinson's, this is tenfold, right? Anything that is not used will disappear. Very often I get the comment from people that, I feel very weak. My legs feel weak. My arms feel weak. I hear it all the time. And very often what I spend a lot of time explaining to people is that in Parkinson's, rarely is it true muscle weakness, it's motor patterning. And what happens is that when you don't use those motor patterns properly, they start to atrophy, they start to disappear. So as we exercise and we start using those motor programs properly, people start to feel stronger, even though their muscles may be the same size. They start to feel stronger because we've now started using those motor patterns, and they are building strength in their motor patterns in their brain. And again, if we stop doing those exercises and motor patterns, people will start to feel weak again. And that's just an example of that use it or lose it principle. So lastly, we're going to very briefly talk about physical therapy versus personal trainers versus online coaching, and what things you might want to consider when you're choosing what's best for you. So questions to consider when you're looking at whether or not you should be choosing, like I said, a physiotherapist or a trainer. The first is, have you been assessed? So the European guidelines suggest that every person who has been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease get a full assessment from a physiotherapist who works specifically with Parkinson's. So this is important because assessment gives us a baseline. It allows us to look at your posture, your balance, your motor control, your gait, your muscular activity, all those things that need to be caught early on and addressed in a program in order to make it as optimal as possible for you. So if you haven't been assessed, then I would strongly suggest that at least once early in diagnosis, and then following up every 6 to 8 months to keep track and keep you accountable. If you've had a fall, that's a really important time to be assessed by a physiotherapist. To check on your balance, to work on falls management and balance strategies. If you have pain, so very often people report back pain or shoulder pain. Those are very important things, again, to have assessed. They can be created through Parkinson's symptoms. They can also be on top of Parkinson's symptoms, and it's important to understand where that pain is coming from and manage it so that you can exercise as functionally as possible and as best as possible and get that pain under control. Have you noticed a change in function? So if you've noticed that something is functionally different than it used to be. So for example, rolling in bed used to not be that hard, and now it's very, very challenging. Putting on my jacket used to be hard, used to be easy, and now it's challenging. I can't get up to go to, the kitchen without having to try and stand up 6 times. So anything that is a significant change in function, you want to get assessed. The fifth thing to consider, is what are your goals? So if you have specific questions, if you want to get a program set up for you, if you are, again, newly diagnosed, things like that, then those are reasons to go see a physiotherapist. If your goal is maintenance and you've had a program developed and you want to maintain that program, you want accountability, you want somebody to be there for you as you exercise, that might be a time to consider a trainer or somebody who can see you more frequently. Are you consistent with your exercise? So very often people start on a program, but consistency is very challenging. And this can be challenging not just because of the general challenges of exercise, but also because motivation and apathy are non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's. So those can be barriers to exercise. So if you're not consistent with your exercise routine, then looking at a physiotherapist or a trainer are both good options to make sure that you get on a accountability program. So somebody who is there to tell you, yes, you're doing a good job, this is what you need to be doing, or I'm going to meet you every week because you're not being consistent with your program or whatever it may be. So at that point, looking into a physiotherapist or a trainer are both good options to make sure that you're maintaining the consistency of your exercise program. So again, not sure if you can see the little writing here, but this is just a slide that shows you the European guidelines on Parkinson's and physiotherapy. And again, what they say is that, you want to use physiotherapy as an assessment tool as soon as you've been diagnosed. If you are having difficulty exercising, if you have questions about specific exercise types, frequencies, intensities, safety issues, etc., and to set up a program for you. Often, once a program is set up, your physiotherapist can work with your trainer to help educate them a little bit on Parkinson's and challenges you may face, or things that they want to work on and things that they want to avoid. And that's a great time to make sure that your physiotherapist and your trainer are communicating so that you can use both as optimally as possible. So personal trainers definitely have cost and convenience benefits, and they're a great tool to use for, again, accountability and having a program that is kind of changing and adapting over time and that continues to challenge you. When you're going to a trainer, you want to ask about their experience in education. There are courses that trainers can take in treating Parkinson's disease, both the power course and a course that I teach. So they have options of education. So just make sure you're asking about their experience. Have they ever treated somebody with Parkinson's? What's their education and background? Let your physio know. So if you're being treated by a physiotherapist or you've been assessed by a physiotherapist, let them know that you're going to see a trainer so that they can communicate with that trainer. Communication within your entire healthcare team is extremely important, right? Your neurologist should know if you're seeing a physiotherapist. Your physiotherapist should know if you're seeing a trainer. All those components are really important to connect so everyone can be on the same page and really working towards helping you achieve your goals. And again, make sure that if you're looking at an online option, that it is Parkinson specific, and that whoever is teaching it has some knowledge or background in Parkinson's programming. Again, online is a great resource. You just want to make sure that you're being a little bit careful to vet the programs that you're going to be using. So some take-home messages. I know that's a lot of information. We're going to wrap it up, but a few things I want you to leave this presentation remembering. Number one is that exercise is integral. It's such a key component of treating Parkinson's disease. I can tell you that after treating people with Parkinson's specifically for a long time now, it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference to symptoms, and it makes a huge difference to how people look over time. So it is a really, really integral and key component to making sure that you're treating your disease properly. It can help you manage your symptoms now, and it can help you mitigate disease progression. So even if you don't feel like you have a lot of symptoms now, getting on a Parkinson-specific exercise plan is really important because it can help manage the progression of those symptoms over time. The earlier you start exercising, the better. So Make sure that you are exercising as soon as you can, that you have a Parkinson-specific exercise plan put in place. The sooner the better. Like I said, the research tells us that when it comes to neuroplastic change and protecting those neurons in the brain, the sooner we start, the better the results. It's important to know that exercise is changing your brain to change your body, right? We are trying to create change in the brain to change the motor symptoms that you're feeling on the outside. So that neuroprotective effect that we talked about, that neuroplasticity in the brain, your brain has immense and enormous capacity for change, and we can use exercise to really draw on that. So I want you to remember that research supports the benefits from various types of exercise. We had that list of, dance, yoga, tai chi, aerobic, treadmill training, biking, etc. But intensity and the fact that it's Parkinson's specific are really key to optimizing the effects of your routine. So we want to make sure that you're working at a challenging intensity, and we want to make sure that at least somewhere in your routine there's Parkinson's specific exercises. Having a supportive and educated network of health professionals is really important to make sure that you get the exercise and support that you need. So we want to help you live well right now, and we want to help you live better in the future. And making sure that you surround yourself with a really supportive team of health professionals is a great way to make sure that happens. And again, that can be physiotherapists, trainers, your neurologist, your doctor, a counselor, a social worker, right? Everyone who can be there to help support you in what is the Parkinson's journey, and make sure that your goals are being focused on and achieved. So get assessed early on, and then use the resources available to you to create your goals and implement a plan to reach them. So again, I really strongly suggest that everyone be assessed by a physiotherapist early on, but that there are also a lot of resources available to you once you've been assessed. So again, the Parkinson's Society BC is a great, phenomenal resource for, therapists around the city, for group classes, for Parkinson's activities that are going on in events. So use them. There's the Parkinson's Society of Canada that you can use as well. You can reach out if you're looking for physiotherapists. The Physiotherapy Association of BC has a Find a Physio website, where you can try and find physiotherapists who have certain educational backgrounds. But there are a lot of resources out there. There's also a lot of not-for-profit places that do great things for Parkinson's and exercise in varying areas. So the Michael J. Fox Foundation and Davis Fitty in the States have some great resources. And if you look, I'll provide for you at the end the website, my website that shows you the resources link where you can go and find some resources through them. But there are lots of resources out there. So, the internet is a wonderful thing. Make sure you search them and use them to help kind of implement that plan and get you all the information that is available to you. So,
questions or you want to bounce off ideas, please do email us at info@parkinsons.bc.ca, or also just call. That's what our information referral line is, and we can help you find resources in your community and get you connected to the right services. This is something that the Society does, and we're happy to do it. So we have the staff and we're here. Thank you again, Naomi, for joining us. And